Let's start with these words from President Lincoln. They're hopeful, right? But they also set up an absolutely massive challenge. How do you heal a country that just spent 4 years trying to destroy itself? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into one of the most complex and honestly, one of the most important periods in all of American history, Reconstruction. This wasn't just about rebuilding. It was a fierce battle between two totally different visions for the country's future, one of forgiveness and one of accountability. So here's our game plan. We'll start with the huge problem facing the nation. Then we'll look at the two competing ideas for how to solve it. We'll see how that conflict exploded into a constitutional crisis. And finally, we'll talk about why the legacy of all this is something we're still dealing with today. Okay, so picture this. The Civil War is finally over. The fighting has stopped, but the country is in ruins, totally shattered. The single biggest question hanging over everyone's head was, what now? How on earth do you put this all back together? And that brings us to this era we call Reconstruction. You know, it wasn't just about repairing buildings. It was about rewriting laws, reshaping society, and figuring out what it even meant to be a citizen. And right out of the gate, two very different approaches popped up, and they were on a collision course. All right, let's dig into that first vision. This one was championed by the man who won the war himself, President Abraham Lincoln. His whole plan was guided by one core idea: forgiveness. For Lincoln, the number one priority was getting the country back together, and fast. He was convinced that a long, harsh, and punishing process would just create more bitterness and more problems down the road. The goal was simple: get the southern states back in and do it as painlessly as possible. And his 10% plan is the perfect example of this. I mean, think about it. The bar for getting back into the Union was set incredibly low. Once just 10% of a state's 1860 voters swore they were loyal, that was it. The process could start. This whole blueprint was built for speed. But that plan, that path of leniency and a quick, merciful peace, was about to be stopped dead in its tracks. Just a few days after the war officially ended, on this one fateful night, everything changed. The man behind the plan for a gentle reunion was suddenly gone. Lincoln's assassination was a massive shock to the nation. And all of a sudden, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, of all places, was now the president. And his ideas about Reconstruction were going to put him on a direct collision course with Congress. At first, Johnson seemed to be following Lincoln's lenient path. But then he started handing out thousands of pardons to high-ranking Confederate leaders, basically letting them walk right back into power. Well, you can imagine this made people in the North furious. It felt like a total betrayal of everything they'd fought for and a huge threat to the millions of newly freed African Americans. So Johnson's actions sparked this huge backlash in Congress, led by a group that came to be known as the Radical Republicans. For them, just forgiving the South wasn't nearly enough. They believed Reconstruction had to be about real justice, about accountability, and about completely transforming Southern society. So Congress came up with its own plan. The Reconstruction Acts put the South under military control, and they laid down a non-negotiable condition for coming back into the Union. States had to ratify the 14th Amendment. This was huge. It wrote birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law right into the Constitution. This wasn't just a new policy. It was a revolution. So you see where this is going, right? You've got two completely opposite blueprints for the future of the country, one from the president, one from Congress. A massive constitutional showdown was pretty much inevitable. Things escalated really fast. Johnson would veto Congress's bills. Congress would just turn around and override his vetoes. To try and box him in, Congress passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, which said he couldn't fire his own cabinet members without their okay. Johnson thought that was unconstitutional, and he defied it. And that was the final straw. The House of Representatives voted to impeach President Johnson. Now, on paper, the charge was about him firing his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who happened to be a close ally of the Radical Republicans. But everybody knew what the real fight was about. It was a battle for control over Reconstruction. The whole drama then moved to the Senate for a trial. And the climax, the absolute peak of this entire struggle, came down to this number: one single vote. That's how close they were to removing the president from office. Johnson kept his job, but by the thinnest margin you could possibly imagine. And even though Johnson was acquitted, the trial itself was a huge deal. It showed just how deeply divided the American government was, and it set a powerful precedent that even the President of the United States isn't above the law. It was a real-time test of the separation of powers during a national crisis. Okay, so that was the big political climax. Let's take a breath and step back for a second, just to really lay out the two opposing ideas that pushed the nation right to the edge. This chart really nails the core conflict. You had Presidential Reconstruction, which was all about speed and forgiveness, but with very little protection for newly freed slaves. And then you had Congressional Reconstruction, which demanded justice and accountability, and wasn't afraid to use federal power to enforce civil rights. These weren't just small policy disagreements. They were two totally different visions for what America should be. And here's the thing. This clash of ideas isn't just some dusty chapter in a history book. The consequences and the questions that were never fully answered are still with us in a very real way. When Reconstruction ended, it left behind this legacy of unfinished work. The failure to permanently secure the rights of African Americans paved the way for a century of segregation and eventually the civil rights movement. And those basic tensions we've been talking about, federal power versus states' rights, quick reconciliation versus guaranteed justice, they are still at the heart of so many debates in America today. So we'll leave you with this question. It's one that connects that chaotic period right after the Civil War directly to our present moment. It's a powerful reminder that the hard work of healing a divided nation and of building a more perfect union is truly never finished. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.